Welcome everyone to Citizen Climate Lobby Canada's March 29th education call. We have Joseph Robertson, Global Director at Citizens Climate Lobby, as our guest speaker here tonight. The topic will be macro-critical resilience. And I'm just going to hand this over to Joe, keep the introduction short. Welcome, Joe, to Citizens Climate Lobby Canada.
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here with us. So I'll just dive right in. The image on your screen, I'm sure you've seen versions of this. This is a historic image for a number of reasons. One, it was actually taken before the official mission began for this satellite. It was still in the testing phase, but the NOAA GOES 16 satellite observing Earth systems took this image of 3 major hurricanes making landfall at the same time. The first time that ever happened in the Atlantic Caribbean basin. On the left, near the Yucatan Peninsula, you see Hurricane Katia. In the middle, the big one, you see Hurricane Irma. And on the right, you see Hurricane Jose. These were, of course, all after Harvey and before Maria. It's important to think about this image just to understand what resilience means and just to understand what the world community is facing right now, trying to pick up speed in dealing with climate change. We are much more vulnerable now than we anticipated being, even within a few decades. And this image is very helpful for understanding how we know that. So resilience intelligence, this has become a big part of our global strategy work, and it's also a focus of the international community now. Resilience means being able to bounce back from a shock. Very importantly, if, for instance, a small island community has solar microgrids, like Richard Branson's home did in the British Virgin Islands, it can bounce back and be back online with virtually all systems operating within a day or two. If it has a more traditional grid system and doesn't have the right services up and running, people can be languishing in disease-infested waters for months or even years. If you look at what happened in Haiti after the earthquake years ago. So resilience intelligence is about how we plan on all fronts to make sure that we can bounce back and be ready to operate the way that we want to reliably. So this map here shows water stress across Syria. The important detail here is that those dark red patches of Syria, that's not necessarily the driest parts of the country. It's the parts of the country that are experiencing the most extreme water scarcity relative to their normal situation. Look at where those red areas are, the far northeast and the entire western edge of the country. And now look at this next map. This is a satellite image, and you can see that the far northeastern corner and the entire western edge, that's where it should be green. That's where Syria grows its food. And so in the years before the Syrian civil war, they were already experiencing historic drought of not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, but nearly 10 years by the time the war started. There was a total economic collapse in much of the country. People couldn't feed themselves, and there was no way to earn anything in the places where they lived, so they had to leave. This is how we can understand what a macro-critical influence is. Food prices, for instance, are a macro-critical indicator. Depending on where they go, they change everything else about the economy. And so other things are macro-critical drivers too. Climate change is an obvious one. It's bigger even than that. Though less immediate in many circumstances. The International Monetary Fund is now looking at macro-critical drivers, even though they only deal with budget math. They don't deal with social issues. They don't deal with sustainable development issues. Nevertheless, the IMF is looking at gender equality issues, open, equal public education for all, reliable access to clean energy, pollution controls, human rights. They're looking at all of those things because they know that in places where those macro-critical drivers are not being taken care of intelligently, where people are being forced to undergo undue suffering, violence, chaos, mistreatment, those places are much more likely to unravel. What you're looking at here is not a city, it's a it's one of the world's largest refugee camps, if not the largest. Syrian refugees living in Jordan. Millions of Syrians have been exiled by this crisis. But if you look at Syria as maybe the most well-known or the single worst case that we're aware of, the refugee crisis the world's experiencing right now is the worst in history. There are over 65 million people displaced. And there are estimates that there may be as many as half that much more that we just don't know about because they're so marginal to begin with. As an example of how marginal refugees can be from start to finish, and so be missed by all the ways that we would count people. A significant proportion of the refugees coming into some of the Greek islands are coming from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is not at war. Bangladesh is not necessarily experiencing this kind of disruption, but it is experiencing extreme glacial melt in the north and flooding, and extreme coastal erosion in the south, and the disruption of its local economies there. There are millions of refugees in the capital already. For a refugee from Bangladesh to get to Greece, they most likely have to travel on foot across India, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, and then somehow get through Lebanon or Turkey to the water. It's not an easy journey, and most likely those particular individuals won't be traced anywhere along their journey. So again, macro-critical indicators are hard to identify because you don't know how to quantify all of it. And they're often things that we don't value in the marketplace. For instance, we don't know how much are we supposed to invest if we want to improve gender equality. We don't know what the exact amount of the social cost of carbon is. And if we can't count all the refugees, then we can't count the easy things like how much food do people need, how much does it cost to build shelters, how long will they be outside of their countries, because we don't even know where they've come from or how many there are. So macro-critical indicators are hard to track, hard to quantify, but they're now front and center on the global agenda. And so here's a few more examples. These are actually some CCL volunteers in Nepal a few years ago after the major earthquake there. And what they were responding to was the collapse of mountainsides into villages. So of course, an earthquake is not a climate impact, but mudslides from glacial melt in the Himalayas are. Normally, mudslides are more common in the warmer part of the year because the glaciers only melt during that part of the year, and the rains tend to fall during that part of the year. But when you have a major earthquake in a country where there's a lot of glacial runoff coming down the mountainside, whole mountainsides collapsed, and you had hundreds of villages that became totally inaccessible, where thousands of people or tens of thousands were killed. So CCL volunteers from Kathmandu went out to the country with Olive Nepal and the Red Cross to help deliver food and medical assistance. This is just one example, right? Pakistan, Nigeria, Yemen have had some of the worst climate impacts that we've seen in the world so far. Yemen's water crisis is perhaps the worst in the history of the world, given its scale and severity, but we're also talking about whether Cape Town, one of the most important cities in South Africa, if not the most important, can continue to supply water. So these kind of impacts are really becoming more visible, more immediate. All of the things that we think about and talk about when we talk about climate change, they all relate back to the causes, the root causes of climate change, but they're all ultimately turning into this question of resilience, intelligence. How resilient are we? Siberia, if you're not familiar with the problem of permafrost melt in Siberia, a Russian engineer at a climate finance conference a few years ago said that they estimate that 60% of Russia has some amount of permafrost under the soil, if not at the surface level. And as it melts, the amount of methane that will be released is obviously going to be devastating for the climate. But one thing that the world hasn't fully thought about is what happens when a country that big, with that amount of industry and that amount of infrastructure, including a lot of energy infrastructure, a lot of military infrastructure, including nuclear weapons. What happens when a country like that suddenly can't keep its infrastructure together for more than a few months at a time because the ground keeps turning to mush and everything breaks apart and collapses and has to be rebuilt? The amount that would have to be invested just there to create real climate smart infrastructure has never been seriously evaluated by anyone, including the Russian government. So yet another serious aspect to think about in terms of the entanglements that we have across the world on climate. This is a picture of the One Planet Summit, which was hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron, who you see pictured there. There were over 50 heads of state present and over 70 countries represented by ministers or ambassadors or heads of state. There were thousands of civil society observers and economists and scientists and experts in the audience as well, participating throughout the day. And what the One Planet Summit produced was, maybe most important of all, a new coalition, a One Planet coalition committed to work around the year in all areas to share best practices, share technology, brainstorm innovative solutions, and support local actors, not just national governments, but businesses, innovators, cities, states, et cetera, planning to do more and go faster on climate change. The motto of the climate negotiating process over the last couple of years has now turned to further, faster, together. And so the One Planet Coalition was created by the French President, the World Bank, and the United Nations Secretary General for that purpose, to manifest that mission, going further, faster, together to achieve real climate resilience. So let me just say a few things about what happened there. There were 12 transformational commitments that were made. There are actually many more than 12, but there were 12 different areas of action. One of them was the world's first official international cooperative climate smart zone for the Caribbean. It includes most of the Caribbean, the Virgin Islands, British US Virgin Islands, some of the smaller islands, but it doesn't include, for instance, Puerto Rico, Vieques, et cetera. So there's more room for improvement. What they want to do is create a whole new paradigm for human development, where all economic development is climate smart, where energy is localized, renewable, can easily be replaced, as on Richard Branson's private island after Hurricane Maria. And they've already committed $8 billion to that mission. So if you think about the much more well-known Green Climate Fund, the $100 billion a year that's supposed to go into it, the United States commitment, which may not be fully fleshed out under the current administration, is only $3 billion. The total amount committed so far is less than 10, but yet this region has $3 billion in partners' commitments, an $8 billion financing strategy, and they're planning to go fully clean energy, climate resilient, infrastructure safe within just a few years. It could be a world first and a great example. If you follow that link at the bottom there, you'll see a thorough outline of some of the details of the commitments that were made. Altogether, asset managers controlling more than $26 trillion in investment, $26 trillion in investment, made a commitment to work with the 100 biggest polluting companies in the world to move them towards zero emissions. So that's not a concrete commitment because we don't know exactly what that means or how it will happen or how they will receive this pressure. But we know that $26 trillion is a lot more than those 100 companies are worth. And so it's a major market signal, maybe the most powerful signal ever sent by investors. That was another one of the commitments. The World Bank committed to stop funding all new exploration for oil and gas starting next year, which is about 30 years sooner than anybody had previously thought was a reasonable date for making that commitment. And that's a major change in international development financing. So one of the side events that happened was a dialogue that we hosted, part of a series we call the Acceleration Dialogues, and it was focused on building a platform that we call Resilience Intel. Resilience intel is essentially starts from a very simple idea, which is, can you count all the money in the economy that does something good for the climate? And one of the things you have to do if you want to count that money is not just count the perfect climate bonds, the ones that are highly verified that we know will do good for the climate. We also have to find a way to count, for instance, when an oil company, where it spends most of its money doing bad things for the climate, when they put windows into their office buildings, what are those windows doing for the climate? It's a small contribution compared to their overall amount. But if you take that same strategy and you look at, for instance, small communities where nobody's invested in fossil fuels, but nobody's thinking all that hard about how to do good for the climate either. They're just spending money as best they can. When they put new windows on a school, when they put paving stones in a driveway, when they think about how they're going to heat or cool a building, how much is that doing for the climate? If they're not connected to a high finance, highly rated climate bond or something like that, or a company that is making an environmental, social, and governance commitment of some kind, it's very hard to know that that climate smart money is being spent. And so we're working with partners to develop a way to do that, to track the aggregate of climate positive cash across all economies everywhere. What that can do is it can incentivize money to move into communities, including at very small scales, where there's a need for microgrid solar energy, there's a need for insulated windows, there's a need for better lighting for studying by night, that kind of thing. Those priorities are not only not in the conventional economy, quote unquote, investable because they're not the standard practice in the industry. They're also not investable because there's no financial instrument into which financiers can put the money. A lot of small communities, they don't have heavy investment from the banking sector. There's no easy way for investors to even know they exist. They're just the people who are kind of left out. And so by doing this, we create the possibility that new ways of investing in communities and in climate smart development can actually arise. The goal is that decision makers at all levels will know more about what are the things they can do personally or in their institutions to get on the better side of climate history. And as they do that, they'll be incentivized to do it, not by us or by what we tell them, but by the fact that that's where the money wants to go. And so if they go there, they'll have more ready access to new money, whether it's credit or investment or public sector spending. Ultimately, the goal is if you have a place where, let's say, 8 out of $100 are going to climate good, even though most of it is going to some kind of harm to the climate, can you help develop a roadmap that says, well, here's the easy way for you to go from 8 out of $100 to 10 to 12 to 20 to 30 just in the next 5 years. And in fact, it's going to cost you nothing because all you have to do is make different choices. You don't have to spend more money, just spend it on different things. That's something that a lot of people are already doing well, but they aren't doing it with all this extra information about the hidden climate money that's available already. And so in this partnership, we're working to make that possible. And ultimately the goal is, can we create a top line indicator where the financial sector can consider not only stock price and credit ratings and things like that and quarterly returns, but also maybe they can consider the long-term global resilience value of an investment. And if they know that's the thing that's going to pay off and that's the thing people want and that's where there's going to be a hotter investment opportunity, then even though that may not be the way that sustainability thinking works, that's the way finance thinking works, they can be aligned for the first time. And so this is a long-term project, but it's part of what we're now doing to try to help this One Planet Coalition and help this overall global commitment to resilience take off. Here's a room which I'm sure when I'm done, Kathy will want to say some words about, but in fact, maybe even now while I'm talking, this is an open dialogue that was held at the COP23, the 23rd annual climate negotiations, UN climate negotiations in Germany last November. It was the first time ever that a global climate negotiating process had an official meeting, not a side meeting, not a consultation, but an official meeting as part of the negotiating process where stakeholders outside of government including cities and regions, but also indigenous peoples, groups representing women and youth, environmental NGOs, business associations, etc., could sit down at the table with government negotiators and with UN officials and talk about the future of the negotiations. Kathy, did you want to share anything about being in that room?
Yes, I would love to, and please stop me if my audio is not that great. I'm on a new computer today. Yes, the Talanoa, the dialogues that I experienced at the Bonn United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change talks or COP23 were transformative for me. I sat in that room for 3 hours, and all these people around the table spoke with fierce honesty about the climate crisis. I cannot specifically say what they said because Chatham House rules applies, but for 3 hours, people from all over the world, including civil society, spoke. And I left that room with such a sense of hope, and it just listening, the listening was so key. It was amazing. So thanks for letting me share that, Joe.
Thank you, Kathy. It was exciting, especially for those of us who focus on engagement, to witness the actual engagement from inside government and outside government, people sitting together and brainstorming the future that way. In the lower right-hand corner there, you see a link which shows you a proposal that we made that suggested this kind of standard and other background-related innovations to make engagement more and more a part of the climate negotiations. This event happened because Fiji, which was presiding over the 23rd annual negotiations, has a desire for that kind of engagement to happen. Their thinking is very much like Citizens Climate Lobby's thinking, in the sense that we both believe that by involving people who are not necessarily the experts, not necessarily the power brokers, not necessarily the office holders, by involving the outside minds in the conversation, what we get is a more diverse conversation, a different way of looking at possibility, and higher ambition. Fiji has that idea, and so they said, let's hold a meeting in the spirit of Talanoa. Talanoa is a Fijian word that means a kind of dialogue where everyone at the table is a peer of everybody else, regardless of power or influence. You can imagine how much Fiji would feel committed to that, being a small island state, extremely vulnerable to climate change, representing not only the other small island developing states, but also having been given this platform to preside over the global negotiations. The year before, Fiji held the presidency of the United Nations General Assembly and hosted the world's first UN Ocean Conference. So with all of that capability to lead and all of that momentum, Fiji took the position, we should involve everybody in this discussion. And when we are not holding the presidency, there should be a way for us to be able to sit down at the table with the United States and China and as equals, which is what the convention, the climate treaty, really calls for. Negotiate our way out of this mess, not negotiate against each other, but with each other. And so the spirit of Talanoa was the reason for that meeting. What the COP23, those negotiations achieved, was the creation of something called the Talanoa Dialogue. The Paris Agreement mandates that in 2018, at the end of the year, during the COP24 negotiations, there will be a facilitative dialogue where all of the countries, 195 nations, plus the European Union as its own party, will support each other in learning about best practices, sharing successes, solving problems, transferring technology, financing commitments. All of these things facilitate each other's increasing of ambition. And so Fiji proposed, along with Morocco, which held the negotiating presidency the year before, that Talanoa become the spirit of that dialogue. And then they added something really revolutionary, which was not only would the Talanoa dialogue happen inside the negotiations between the countries in the spirit of Talanoa, but there would be a preparatory phase, which would be year-round and open to every living person on Earth. as long as you are transparent, you represent yourself accurately, you're constructive, you follow the spirit of Talanoa, which is the way CCL operates, show admiration, respect, and gratitude. Don't attack people, just try to be constructive and work together. And so we've put together a toolkit to help people everywhere at any level hold whatever kind of meeting they want. If it's a meeting of students or a meeting of citizens in the community, or if it's a meeting between government officials and the local community, a town hall meeting, whatever kind of meeting people want to have, they can use that toolkit. The link is there at the bottom right, to structure that meeting and also to make official submissions, which will be posted online in a forum hosted by the United Nations for this purpose. And the reason that all of those submissions will be posted online is to help support the governments in the process having access to the widest possible, most ambitious thinking about how to solve climate change. So a couple more things here. The Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition has been a really interesting innovation. I'm sure many of you have heard of it before. It officially launched at the Paris negotiations in 2015. We were involved at Citizens Climate Lobby in helping to create it for a year and a half before that. And we've been consistently involved. And so far, some of the successes of this coalition are, one, creating a new model for global governance. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda and the Paris Agreement both called for multilateral partnerships. What that means is partnerships between nations are multilateral. Multi-level means they're not just with governments. They can be with civil society groups, with community organizations, with businesses, with private sector finance institutions, with different levels of government, cities and states, et cetera. The Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition includes governments, UN agencies like the World Bank, businesses, including some of the world's largest oil companies, and civil society organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby. And the mission is to try to cover as much of the world's carbon pollution with some kind of price on carbon as fast as possible. The goal that was adopted during the first high-level assembly, which you're witnessing here, was to cover at least half of all global emissions with some kind of carbon price no later than 2025. That's now 7 years from now. And we're actually ahead of the pace, because on the way there was the goal to get to 25% by 2020. And when China implemented its carbon market, that put us over that level. So now the question is, can we also get the prices to be higher, more intense, and more irreversible? And that's a big part of what Citizens Climate Lobby is trying to do there. And so finally, this whole year is a year for engagement on an unprecedented scale. There is the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. There's the Resilience Intel work that we're doing, our Citizens Climate Engagement Network, and the Talanoa Dialogue, and the toolkit for local meetings. These are all opportunities. And in September, of course, there's also a Global Climate Action Summit, which will feature commitments from cities and states, but also from businesses and communities, all working together internationally to fulfill the mission of something called the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, which started at the climate negotiations in 2016, and which is an effort to make sure that this kind of cooperation becomes the norm on a permanent basis. So all of those things are now happening, and we are trying as much as we can to bring the CCL spirit, which is so much like that Talanoa spirit, into these discussions in the different ways I've laid out so far. And I'd be happy to take questions from all of you now.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was fantastic. I would just like to point out, we have CCL Ireland, Graham Caswell on the call, as well as, I believe, Mike from the regional coordinator for CCL Africa is also on this call. So welcome to both of you. That's a first at Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. Wanted to highlight that for the record. Secondly, Joe, thank you so much for explaining all these incredible things that are going on behind the scenes, and I hope everyone gets a sense of why I am feeling so hopeful. I have had one question already sent to me, And if anyone wants to ask a question, it's preferred that you put it in the chat box. Nobody has yet, but I'll start with this first question. It comes from Tom Cullen, and it is, what are the best steps Canada's federal and provincial governments can take to signal action on climate change to the international community / governments?
Well, thanks, Tom, and hello, good to hear from you again. And good to have all of you on as well. It's great that you're here, Mike and Graham. So first of all, I just want to say that I first came to understand how much good Citizens Climate Lobby Canada has done when Kathy asked me to attend the Climate Summit of the Americas a couple of years ago in Toronto. I sat at a table like the one that you saw in that open dialogue. I was probably about 10 feet away from Glenn Murray, and who was at the time Environment Minister for Ontario. And he repeatedly looked over to me to communicate to me that part of what he was saying was because Citizens Climate Lobby had helped him understand things in this way. And he listed 3 ways to price carbon. And the 3 ways were, of course, cap and trade, and then revenue neutral carbon tax and carbon fee and dividend. He didn't mention any other kind of carbon tax except revenue neutral carbon tax and carbon fee and dividend. He gave 2/3 of the policy portfolio to CCL messaging. And that's a huge sign of the kind of success that you've all had in Canada. Canada's provincial and federal governments are doing a really good job signaling to the international community their leadership. What can they do that's more than that? Right now, Canada is one of the countries that is helping to lead a new carbon pricing coalition of the Americas. This is something that I think maybe informally was kicked off by the Cali Declaration, Cali, Colombia, where a number of countries committed to work together on carbon pricing. And the goal is to establish a hemispheric carbon price. And so the federal government, by pushing for a price floor, has already started that signal. That's a huge contribution to the international effort. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, is now trying to do the same thing across the European Union. And he may succeed, and that will be partly because of Canada's leadership. One of the things that we're trying to do in the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is to work with jurisdictions, both national and subnational, that prefer a carbon tax over cap and trade, to establish a kind of working group that will help those political leaders and policymakers work together and partner and create a kind of carbon tax cooperative zone without having to buy and sell credits. Because the international discussion on carbon pricing has tended to be that if you want to collaborate across borders, then you have to create identical markets and buy and sell each other's credits. And then you are connected in a de facto kind of way. It's not necessarily the case that makes the price stronger. But we believe that if that kind of cooperation can happen without the trading, it can just happen because the policy alignment is so strong. Then there's a lot more room for carbon taxes, carbon dividends, and for the kind of policies that we think will get prices much higher, faster, and have the kind of positive benefits that we know we can see from fee and dividend. So that's one thing. That kind of cooperation is an important step. And that can be done by the federal government and also by subnational jurisdictions working through the Carbon Pricing Coalition of the Americas and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. The other thing I think is really important is to look at climate smart investment priorities. So the conventional thinking on climate finance has been that it's very expensive to deal with climate change. It's basically charity. And we're not sure that everyone else is going to help us solve it. So therefore, maybe it's not the best investment. And that's why governments have been slow in general to throw money into climate finance. The World Bank, on the other hand, has not been slow. And the reason is because the conversation about macro-critical resilience is one they understand all too well. They know that if they pour a lot of money into a country whose institutions are on the verge of collapse, it's very likely the money will not be well spent and that the investment payoff will never happen. So resilience is something they know is important, and they want to see that happen. They want to change the conditions in which the investment takes place. That kind of climate smart investment thinking is really important. And whether it happens at home in Canada or whether it's part of a wider global agenda, I think if Canada is willing to look at what that looks like, public-private partnerships that allow for, let's say, the public sector to put up bonds that are climate smart, and the private sector buys into those bonds, and what was initially a commitment of 100 turns into a wider pool of several hundred going after the same investment. That kind of smart financing for climate priorities can change the way people in Africa farm. It can change the way mountainside communities in Nepal or Peru build their infrastructure. It can change the way people in Puerto Rico or in Sudan get energy. And all of those things end up being contributions to global climate action. So I know that some of that work is already in the pipeline and there's thinking about it, but there can always be more, and it can happen at all levels. And so I would say, in addition to what we talk about with fee and dividend, thinking about how fee and dividend is not just a good solution for climate change and reducing emissions, but how it also, or similar policies, also can help enable a country to become a major investor in the climate smart future economy. That's a big ask. It's something they can do that's really big, and others will follow.
That's a lot to digest, but it's so awesome. Thank you. I got it. There's no questions in the hopper currently, so I am going to ask a question. So what I'm hearing is it looks like we're going to be able to take real-time data, maybe even satellite data, and and combine that with on-the-ground investments to create macro critical resilience. So through our financial systems. So I hope I got that right. Like that's me just rewording and rethinking what you are saying. But one thing that I was hoping you'd bring up and you didn't, so maybe now is the time to bring it up and add one more terminology to this awesome lesson, is the role of blockchain technology in financial investments and how that all fits in. Do you feel comfortable just briefly explaining what blockchain technology is and then how it fits into this giant scheme here currently?
Yeah, one thing to know about blockchain is if you're in a conversation about it and you think that you're not quite sure what it is, please be assured that even the people who are acting like experts are probably nearly as uncertain as you are. It's really a new area, and it's a little bit beyond our understanding how it works. So there are some very specific technical details that make it easy to understand, easy to describe, but the transformational part of it, how it changes the way we organize and how we deal with information, is something we've never had access to as a sentient species before. So we're still figuring out what it means. So even the experts are still learning. Essentially what blockchain is it's a system for recording information where when, let's say you send me a message, and so now there's two of us that are involved in this transaction. The transaction is recorded on both of our devices. The distributed ledger technology, which is known as blockchain, essentially distributes that same archive to as many different devices as possible. The reason is to create redundancy so that it can't be hacked. So if you have the same information in a million places and no one knows exactly where those million places are, and they're all interconnected, not necessarily through Verizon or AT&T or a major telecom, but they're connected to each other directly. And in order for a new transaction to happen and to update that archive, so now we're talking about finance. So for instance, you have 30 of something and you give me 6, and now I have 6 and you have 24. If I decide to give some of my 6 to someone else, all of that new information has to be recorded in all of those places. And so it's very difficult to hack all of them at the same time. In fact, it's mathematically impossible for all intents and purposes, which means that the information is secure. So that's the basic functionality of blockchain. The word chain is a reference to the fact that those individual blocks of information are then sequenced one after the other. So every time you access one, you access the whole history. So you can see the history and provenance. You can know if something is legitimate or not. So if, for instance, let's say a builder were to be taking money from organized crime or something like that, that would be recorded and it would be transparent and they wouldn't be able to do it. And if for some reason they were able to do it, but it was a reputational risk for others, others would know to avoid them. So that's why blockchain has this promise to be able to make finance, more reliable, more secure, and less corrupt. It was created to make Bitcoin work. So governments initially were not big fans because Bitcoin is kind of like a rival to them. Governments manage currencies, and this is a currency managed by no government. But the reason that blockchain was created to facilitate that was because they needed to know that the individual units of Bitcoin were secure, that they couldn't be hacked or counterfeited. And so far, they have succeeded. You can create other similar currencies, but you can't counterfeit it. And so that's a whole new kind of digital information sharing. It's not that hard to falsify digital information. That's why we've been having all these problems the last few years with data security. So that's a big innovation. The fact that they did it for that purpose, to create a currency that was artificial, belonged to no nation state, and couldn't be hacked or dismantled, meant that what they were doing was they were putting power in the hands of individuals. So the people who maintain the system behind the scenes in this distributed network are actually the institution. There is no central institution. And that's why blockchain has now become popular as this sort of revolutionary idea for how people can create distributed microgrids of energy trading, use, in fact, units of energy as currency to buy food or to build homes and things like that. The idea is that that decentralized network that is not even as centralized as the internet is, but far more decentralized, person to person, and then magnified out to all of those different devices that back up the information. Essentially what they're trying to do is get rid of corruption, enhance transparency, and empower individuals. So if blockchain can be developed in a way where it allows us to connect Earth systems, science data to information about, wage levels and gender equality and, financial sector information, quarterly reports from corporations, budget planning from national governments, emissions reductions targets under the Paris Agreement, those things could all be interconnected and cross-referenced, and they could be managed by a system that can't be falsified. So for instance, if an automaker wants to pretend that its emissions are doing one thing when in reality they're doing something else, it would be much harder for them because it would only take one person knowing they're lying to correct their lie, but it would take millions of hacks to falsify the record, if that makes sense. So I know that's a long explanation, but for blockchain, it's pretty short. And I hope it's somewhat clear. The idea is people can be in charge of information, and the information can be more reliable without a trusted institution as the intermediary, because we now are seeing that institutions can be corrupted. So I think there's still a lot of idealism, which is not a bad thing, but it's a little ahead of the curve at the moment. Right now, we're still figuring out if this is fully useful. And in order to do that, Citizens Climate Lobby has joined something called the Climate Chain Coalition to make sure that the better intentions and the real transparency value of blockchain is what is focused on when it's used for UN climate negotiating processes and climate finance information services.
Excellent answer. And yes, that was one of the shorter explanations of blockchain technology I have heard. I listened to a half an hour program on it. So you summed it up quite nicely in about 3 minutes. So we have 2 more questions.
Thanks,
yes, we have 2 more questions here, and I think that might do it. Maybe one more, we'll see. And I just, because we have international callers on the line, I'm just gonna expand a little bit on the first question. This week, Canada had something historic happened. We had all of our Auditor Generals from across Canada, all of our provincial, territorial, and federal Auditor Generals got together and did an assessment on our Canada's greenhouse gas emission targets and how well we're doing to achieve those. And it's pretty obvious we're going to miss, most provinces and federally are going to miss our targets, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. As well, fossil fuels continue to be a priority. There's pipelines that are being approved, as well as new fossil fuel subsidies being created. So we're having increased polarization in Canada. So this is a beautiful question. It comes from Laura in Nelson. So her question is, how do you see we could use something like Talanoa dialogue to help our national dialogue?
Well, that is a really excellent question. Thank you, Laura. So first thing I would say is, it is frustrating sometimes when you're doing citizens climate lobby work to watch polarization and tensions around climate and energy rise. It feels like things are going backwards. But from my standpoint, it's not something for us to be afraid of. We exist to deal with that in Citizens Climate Lobby. We are sort of like, that's our market, is to try to neutralize polarization. So stepping into the middle of that and saying there's a better way forward is what we're here to do. And the Talanoa dialogue is a great way to do it. So for instance, here, I'll give you an example. My fiancée Gina and I just adopted a dog. She's a beautiful little puppy from Kentucky. She comes from the 3rd poorest county in the United States. And the reason that we adopted her in Minnesota was because there's so little economic activity in Harlan County that people are having to turn their animals in huge numbers. They can't afford to feed pets. And so for years, what was happening was this was happening under the radar. People weren't noticing it, and their pets were just being put to sleep at these shelters. 98% in the one shelter where our dog comes from were being put to sleep. And so a pet rescue started working with that shelter, and now they've reduced what they call the kill rate to just 2%. So most of the dogs are being rescued now. But what they're actually doing is they're migrating from a very poor, very coal-dependent county to a place that has all kinds of more diverse economic options. And I tell you that story because it's kind of personal story that people might tell about a place they come from, where their only economy has been extraction. What tends to happen in those kind of places is very much like what goes on in Harlan County, where you have an industry that is totally monolithic. It will only tolerate one kind of activity. It will only tolerate one commodity. Any more diverse economy is seen as a threat. In a lot of those places in the United States, the whole towns were built and all the businesses were owned by the same company that owned the mine. And as soon as they're done, everything dies. And so I tell you that story because I think in places where the polarization is happening, it's happening because people's stakes are really high. People think that this is an existential issue on both sides. On one side, it's existential because their whole economy will live or die based on the decisions of politicians. And on the other side, the whole planet may live or die based on the decisions of people like them in communities like that want to work. So having a Talanoa dialogue where people come together, and in our toolkit, we ask people to share personal stories, reasons for being there, what they care about, what they value, what brings them there. before they try to develop affinities around different issues, and then talk about what kind of world do you want to live in 20 years. And in those smaller groups, thinking about 20 years down the road, do what's called backcasting. So say, okay, well, if we're going to be there in 20 years, where do we have to be in 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, and where should we start now? And when you have that kind of conversation, you start to have more inclusion because people have been heard. You tend to find people all want a good future. So that's a good place to come together. And then hopefully what comes out of that is a different kind of thinking about how aggressive we should be now in the moment when we're getting started. Because if we don't start fast, we won't have that more ambitious future. So I would encourage everybody who wants to try to deal with that polarization to try to have Talanoa discussions and remember that much more important than the climate policy that emerges from it, or the, whether or not the people in the room agree with your personal policy preference, the more important thing is that people are now all part of the climate conversation. And you can empower people in those extraction-oriented communities to actually have a direct voice in the climate negotiating process. It's not going to go backwards. It's not going to go their way. The whole world is running in the same direction, some faster than others. That's what's frustrating people. So if you can get those people into a conversation and help them see their future, I think you can probably do a lot of good there.
Fantastic answer. I hope that helped, Laura. And I sense a CCL Canada action coming down the pipes after that answer. Monthly action. Okay, so and this next question comes from David Mintz in Saskatchewan. You mentioned establishing permanency in carbon pricing mechanisms. In Canada, there are opposition parties putting forward policies based on dismantling existing carbon pricing mechanism. That's sad but true in Canada. I didn't know if you knew that, Joe. What type of mechanism, fee and dividend or cap and trade, is more embedded and difficult to dismantle? Great question.
That is a great question. So I think what I said was that part of the mission of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is to make sure that pricing mechanisms that go into place are irreversible. And so permanency is actually the problematic word. For people who are trying to dismantle carbon pricing policies, often their motivation is they think it's imposing an unfair burden. They think the longer it goes on, the more unfair the burden will be. And whether they're right or wrong, they're going to fight it. It's a different thing that a price signal to the marketplace or coming through the marketplace is irreversible, because what it does is it tells businesses where they need to be if they want to survive. In most situations, nobody knows that kind of thing. Most restaurants fail. Most entrepreneurs have to move on to something else rather than their first idea. The most successful people in business fail again and again, but they succeed in a big way on the big things that they really learn about. A price signal that's irreversible gives a lot of clarity. It helps people who wouldn't know where they're supposed to be 5 or 10 years from now have a lot more clarity about that and plan better for the future. I think developing more awareness of that is part of it. In places where it's taken for granted that the price signal will do the job itself and everyone will just come on board, a lot of people, and maybe rightly, feel that that's a hostile attitude. And policies can be designed to express that or to not express that. I think the fee and dividend policy that CCL promotes is the best in this particular area, because it is, if it's implemented, virtually irreversible. I mean, you can't really succeed in politics by taking money away from people. But the policy sunsets on its own when society has successfully overcome its addiction to fossil fuels. And it gives money to communities so they can have their own income. In places like Harlan County, Kentucky, that hasn't had a really thriving economy since its coal boom started to phase out, those communities will just have income coming in that they can do other things with. They can start restaurants, they can they can keep their pets and do other things, rather than what's happening now where people are just in a downward spiral. And so they don't have to choose between downward spiral and downward spiral because of environmental reasons. They can choose something better that goes with the environmental cost. So I think putting money back into communities, carbon dividends, I think the design of fee and dividend is the only way I can think of to make a carbon price truly irreversible.
Another great answer. I hope that was okay. I hope that answered your question, Dave. We have 2 questions left. I can take no more, but Joe, you only have 5 minutes, so you have 2 minutes to answer each of them.
Okay.
Okay. So this one is from Lynn, just outside of the national, well, she's in the national capital region, but out on the outskirts. So this week we had the Auditor General's report, and within that report is that they need, there's a lot of gaps in knowledge. So I think this is coming from that. So is it necessary to assess the risk of harm from a threat in order to know how to become resilient to that threat? Because Canada doesn't have risk assessments for climate threats. We just have it in pockets. So that's where it's coming from. So again, is it necessary to assess the risk of harm from a threat in order to know how to become resilient to that threat?
Yes. I mean, it's possible to just, so yes and no, I guess. There's a way to do it where what you do is you plan to essentially not face that threat. Then you don't have to know how big it is, you just have to know how to avoid it. That's a different thing. But if you're planning to face it, like you live in the Caribbean and you know storms will be at least as bad as they were historically and probably worse, then you need to have some sense of what the limits are of the technology you're using, at what pressure does a wall crumble, et cetera. An example that I might use is a few years ago, after Superstorm Sandy hit New York and New Jersey, the idea became popularized that there should be a retractable seawall that closes off New York Harbor, running from Coney Island, New York to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. And when I first heard the idea, I thought, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard, for a very specific reason. And I was gratified to know that the head of the Army Corps of Engineers had the same reason, which is if you've ever lived or been to any of these places, you know that a wall from Coney Island to Sandy Hook is pointless because they're both at sea level. So any flood would already be above the land and would just go around the wall. So the wall wouldn't protect anyone from anything, but it could cost $40 billion and 20 to 30 years to build. And it might interfere with shipping and cause ecological disaster in the meantime. So there has to be an examination of feasibility. There has to be an examination of vulnerability. The region around New York needs to know, is green infrastructure better, meaning are wetlands better at absorbing a storm surge than a retractable wall, for instance. And the same kind of thing has to happen all across Canada with permafrost melt and learning about the interaction of waterways and runoff from drilling and tar sand sites and that kind of thing.
Okay, that's great. Last question, and it comes from Mike in Africa. And just for everybody else on the call, Nigeria was the first African country to enact green bonds. So kudos to Nigeria. So, and Mike's question is, what is the relationship between macro resilience and green bonds?
So great question, Mike. Thank you. And of course, congratulations to Nigeria for issuing that green bond. Nigeria is a great example and a great way to answer the question, because a green bond generally goes in the direction of macro critical resilience. You're improving your chances of having that by having a green bond that's reliable and verifiable. It's going to do something good for sustainable development or for the climate. But if you have an oil-rich country that has a big oil export economy, that has environmental problems from leakage from drilling operations and human rights issues related to drilling, all of those things are macro critically negative. So in order to get to the place where you're macrocritically resilient, you essentially have to get rid of those practices. So the green bonds get us on the road and they go in that direction. But a country can't really develop serious macrocritical resilience until it can overcome the need to engage in those practices. So essentially, it's in the direction, but it needs to go all the way.
Okay, that brings us to the top of the hour, which means this call is over. I would like to thank you, Joe, for this. I certainly am feeling even more hopeful again and have a lot of peace in my heart right now, entering into the long weekend for many of us. Happy Easter, everyone. Happy Passover. Happy end of winter, Canada, and as well as Ireland, I guess. And everybody have a great weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kathy.
That was fantastic. I'm going to stop recording and we can stay on the call for a minute.